think about.
I'm Chris Richardson, and this is Not a Pipe podcast. Today I'm very pleased to be speaking with Catherine Soussloff about her book, Foucault on Painting. She's a professor of art history, visual art, and theory at the University of British Columbia and a professor emeritus from the University of California, Santa Cruz. Her book, Foucault on Painting, is not only an incredible work of historiography, art history, critical theory, it's also related to the namesake of this podcast. This Is Not a Pipe, also known as The Treachery of Images, is a painting by Rowman and Littlefield, a surrealist painter, as well as an important essay written by Michel Foucault, who is among my favorite authors and scholars of the 20th century. And so it's really a pleasure to be able to speak to her today about her work and in relation to some of those things. So Catherine, thank you again for speaking to me today. I guess I have to start with This Is Not a Pipe. It's a namesake of the podcast. It's also a famous essay by Michel Foucault. When I was coming up with this podcast with my friend Mike Elrod, we both loved this painting, loved what we had read about it with Michel Foucault, and it happened to be sitting on my desk at the time, so we were like, let's call it This Is Not a Pipe podcast. But I don't think we're the only ones who are inspired and who thought about this, either in education, in grad school, or during our work, or maybe some people have just come across this and it's captured something. What makes The Treachery of Images, or This Is Not a Pipe, such an important cultural object for people studying cultural studies, art history, but also I think for the general public as well? Why is this such a captivating painting and something that continues to be spoken about and written about?
The painting has several titles. This Is Not a Pipe. The Treachery of Images is the correct one, I believe. And sometimes the title is Ceci n'est pas une pipe in the French version. I'm thinking that this painting's significance beyond Foucault, because it has a great significance beyond Foucault for cultural studies and many other fields, as you said, lies in the fact that Magritte made this painting so early. He made it around 1927. It really is early for this sort of thinking thoroughly about language and image, or about word and image. The painting consists of an image of a pipe, as you know, and of the words, Ceci n'est pas une pipe, this is not a pipe, both together on the same canvas. And this sort of painting came to be called word and image painting. And it was invented by the surrealists. Magritte was one of the earliest surrealists, and this painting might be considered one of the earliest word and image paintings. So one reason it's so important historically is that it's really early in the 20th century. The other reason is that it does attempt to address a problem, that is the relationship between words and images, that was a thematic, we could say, for the history of art and the history of visual culture in the 20th century. The thematic between language and image comes up in all kinds of theorizing, first about painting, and of course Magritte's version of it is an oil painting, but it also comes up throughout the century in terms of other media, printmaking media, advertising media, but also then in regards to digital theory and visualizations in the digital media, starting, let's say, in the early 80s. So I think one reason that it's so important is that it carries through as a problem and a thematic in the history of thinking about visual images and language together throughout the 20th century and now into our 21st century.
For Michel Foucault, who was an incredibly important philosopher of the last 100 years, and whom probably everyone studying at all cultural studies, critical theory, or related disciplines is familiar at least in part with his work. What is his significance in relation to art and art history? Because, of course, that wasn't his main thrust of his work, but for anyone who hasn't read your book yet, how does he relate to painting and to the theorization of art?
That's a really great question. I think that one of the major contributions of my book is to suggest that painting was an aspect of art that Foucault found incredibly important for provoking his thought about other topics, particularly subjects and subjectivity, and also language and visuality, even though, as you quite rightly state, it's not a major aspect. That is, thinking about painting and art is not a major aspect of his thought. It underlies a great deal of his thought, starting from the very beginning, starting from the late 50s, when he explored issues of the image and imagination. And then in his earlier books in the 60s, when he talked about particularly about the prison and about issues having to do with the idea of what is modernity and where does the image play a role in our understanding of the modern world. And then it continues. First, he does address it, a painting overtly, starting in his study, that is the first chapter of The Order of Things. But then he also goes on to consider painting throughout the rest of his work, even in his work on sexuality, which was so important for thinking about queer politics and subjectivity. And then also later in his thinking about the nature of existence, painting comes up over and over again as an example, if not as a serious study.
Your work, as you say, is important because it highlights something that can easily be overlooked when thinking about other things that Foucault has written about, like prisons, sexuality, history of madness. So I'm curious how you started to put this work together. Did you, for instance, read through Foucault's books and articles looking for examples of paintings or references to paintings, or did you sort of go back knowing that the first chapter, as you said, in The Order of Things is about Las Meninas? How did you start to gather your material?
I'm trying to think back because it's been a while since I started that. My thinking was provoked by the invitation to speak about Foucault and visual culture in a conference that was run by a philosopher at the University of California, Santa Cruz. And he wanted to have a kind of a sampling of many disciplinary views of the significance of Foucault. So he wanted an art historian to speak about Foucault and visual culture overall. When I started to look at that question, when I accepted that invitation, first I accepted it because I had never thought about that really to any great extent. I knew the chapter in The Order of Things on the famous painting of Las Meninas by Diego Velázquez, but I didn't think about what is Foucault's contribution to visual culture overall. And when I started to look, I looked in two places. First, I looked in what we call the secondary literature on Foucault, all of the writings about Foucault and the significance of his work, to see if anybody else had thought that that visual culture was important or was significant. And I also started to look through Foucault's own writings for references on visual culture. And what I found in the first area, which is the secondary literature, I found that not very many people thought that his work on visual culture was important or significant in his overall project. That was tantalizing to me because after I'd read through his own writing, wherever painting or visual culture came up, I saw that I thought it was an underlying point of importance for him. So in some sense, what I found in Foucault himself contradicted what I saw in the secondary literature. So that was where I began, this kind of putting the two together, the assessment of Foucault as a philosopher, and then his own interest in writing about painting and art, visual arts overall.
When you were collecting this, I'm curious if you found that it was easier, perhaps, to talk about Foucault's interest in painting when he talks about it, when he's literally talking about various paintings, or did you somehow find ways in which painting may have influenced him, even though it wasn't as overt? In other words, was it easier to comment on Foucault commenting on painting, or perhaps was it easier to think about how painting in general might have influenced his ideas of subjectivity and other concepts?
I think it was the first instance where I really literally searched through all of his writings to see where painting came up and when and why and in what context. And then I went on to understand the significance of painting for his overall project, for his, let's say, the aspects of philosophy that he felt were so important. I felt I had to have the arsenal of a close reading of his views, his exact views, however minimal they might have been, writings on painting before I could go and think about the overall project of his philosophy and the significance of painting for that.
Yeah, and you also talk about in the book how Foucault's reception in art history was kind of on and off at different periods. And I think that goes for a lot of disciplines with Foucault. where he was picked up in America on some circumstances and not in others. Could you maybe say a little bit about, at least before your book, what Foucault meant to art historians?
Okay, that's a discipline-focused question, which I quite appreciate, since it is my discipline. I have to work incredibly interdisciplinarily across many disciplines in my book and in my thinking about Foucault and my research. But, I was always coming from this position as an art historian in terms of, well, what does it mean for this discipline to think about Foucault and his views on painting? Mm-hmm. You're right. There is an ebb and flow, let's say, in the discipline in terms of its thinking about Foucault and the importance of his writings on painting. It really is a great tidal, let's say, flow around 1970 when the order of things is translated into English from Les mots et les choses and becomes a book that is taken up in many disciplines and across many fields in very, let's say, strong and positive ways, but also in many critical ways. It was kind of, because it was so criticized and so positive, both reactions being present in the US, especially in art history and in visual studies, I would say, aesthetics of the visual. I think that caused its significance to reverberate in the field for a number of years. And so it was important, that first chapter in the order of things on Las Meninas was important in art history for a number of years and still is referred to, for instance, in collections on the theory of art and the history of art and its significance in thinking about art. That essay often appears or is often referred to, even today. And that's pretty consistent. Beyond that, there aren't a lot of other writings by Foucault that are on painting that are really popular in the field, other than This Is Not a Pipe, Ceci n'est pas une pipe. And, you started this interview with that question about that painting. And I think that painting has been incredibly important for the history of contemporary art. The field of art history is dominated now by contemporary art studies. And because of that, significant essays in that area are getting a lot more play and have gotten a lot more play, let's say in the last 25 years. And Foucault's essay, This Is Not a Pipe, is one of them, because it engages with a theoretical way of approaching painting and language together, and images and language together, which isn't, I could say, a topic of concern for contemporary art.
Mm-hmm. Obviously, your voice and your interpretation is important. You're also focused very much on Foucault's voice and his interpretation of painting. I'm wondering how that worked for you and if you found anything that was helpful, either, practically or theoretically, in thinking about how he saw painting and perhaps, maybe you did try to distance yourself, maybe you didn't, but you're interpreting his interpretations. How did that work for you? What did you find useful or difficult?
Well, I would call that method of me interpreting his interpretations and their significance for art history and for the works of art that he encounters. I would call that a historiographical method. Mm-hmm. It has been my method for many years. It's the approach that I take to the history of art because it allows me to engage with the material on a theoretical and, let's say, interdisciplinary basis. But one of the things I always have to keep in mind with such an approach is my position. Mm-hmm. I'm interpreting Foucault, interpreting art, as you say. And in that, I have to be aware of my position as an interpreter, as much as I need to be aware and pay attention to Foucault's position as an interpreter. So it engages a certain, let's say, distancing, as you say, upon my own project, but it also engages me constantly in thinking about how do I look at this work of art he's discussing, and how does that work with how other people have looked at it? At the same time, it allows me to stand back and try to make some conclusions about how we write history and how we theorize about art. And I think it's the best approach to really understand what art theory means. I take that approach, the historiographical approach, as an aspect of the new art history that supposedly was born around 1972 or so, which was when I first started studying art history as an undergraduate. But I also take it to be a way of achieving a certain level of criticism or critique that is often missing in the overwhelming response that people have to the actual art object or to the aesthetic experience, which forbids a certain level of critique. And that is a position. So my position of being a historiographer of art and art history is trying to deal with the aesthetic response, if you will, at another level.
Yeah, which I can imagine is a challenging task, to say the least. When you're doing that, have you found that you've come across a sort of policy for yourself, or maybe formed a sort of ethics of approaching this, where you critically look at and interpret on some level, but then you also maybe step back and represent the critical interpretation of the subject, in this case, Foucault? Like, in other words, when do you intervene and when do you try not to intervene, if at all?
I actually think it's impossible to write about anything without intervening, whether you're conscious or unconscious of that. So if you accept that proposition that you're always intervening because you're writing and interpreting, especially for someone who interprets art and visual culture, that is, you're interpreting a material artifact or object that has to be described and engaged with in the written form. So you're always, somehow my voice is always present, or any interpreter's voice is always present. Any interpreter's attitude or critique is always present. It's just whether or not you're conscious of it, or whether it's an unconscious reaction that might be visible in other ways in your written text, in the final written text or interpretation. It's a really complicated, I guess I would say, question, a complicated audience response question for the writer about the work of art, or the critic of the work of art. And it's really an important one. And as I say, I've chosen the historiographical approach, that is to look at the texts that Foucault wrote about works of art, and also at the same time to look at the artworks themselves and all of the interpretations that have been made of them, to try to negotiate between the two, or amongst them all. I don't think I should say between, but amongst. Mm-hmm. And part of that amongst has in it my own interpretations, my own views of the works of art and of the text that encounter them. I should say that my inspiration methodologically is the work of Hayden White, who is a historian, first and foremost. I mean, he started out as a historian of medieval history and of church history, but he is well known and was well known for most of his career as a philosopher of history or a historiographer of history. And his approach to history suggested that historiography was the clearest way to a solid critique and to making contribution to understanding how the world is represented as history. Now, my interest is the art history, and Hayden White was always suspicious about art history. I'm not suspicious about art history. I enjoy it, I accept it, I participate in it, but I want to approach it in the best possible critical manner to understand, well, what does that representation of art mean in our world today or right now? And what did it mean back then when it was made? What did Foucault's interpretations mean when they were made? And what did earlier interpretations of the works that Foucault looked at mean in their time? That's a historiographical approach.
Mm-hmm. I mean, there's a lot of stuff to unpack in that. I'm curious, though, if you came to a point, maybe before writing this, maybe after, where you felt like you knew enough about Foucault to either start or complete this work. And I ask that because, I mean, Foucault is notorious for being incredibly popular in terms of everyone who studies philosophy, historiography, and other disciplines knows of his work. But I don't think anyone, or very few people, can really say that they've read it all and really well understood it. And so at what point did you become comfortable enough to suggest, not that you know everything, of course, but that you're comfortable enough with Foucault's work to assess how painting in particular affected it, or how he was able to think through it? Was there a point when you felt that you were comfortable enough with it to do this project?
As I said, when I first was asked to deliver a lecture on the significance of Foucault and visual culture and visual arts, I started to look into Foucault's writings. I did enough work for that lecture, which was the preliminary one, to think about, well, what is it that Foucault wrote explicitly about art and when did he write it?
Mm-hmm.
But I hadn't, as you suggest, been able to absorb at that point the vast literary output of Foucault, the philosophical/literary output of Foucault. I spent a great deal of time trying to do that over the years. I haven't read everything, as you say. I've read a lot of it. I think one of the things that allowed me to make the leap into feeling that I would be comfortable talking about where painting belonged in this vast philosophical and literary project was once I realized that I had to read him in French, because many of his translations are, well, some of them are problematic and many are difficult. And I found that going back to the French and reading many of the things that I'd already read in French allowed me to really understand him much better. So I would say that my reading in French helped me make a big leap in this project of writing about Foucault and painting. And so now when I really want to understand Foucault, I always check the French text with the English translation. It's really significantly important. And I think the best writers on Foucault in English have done that.
Yeah, I was actually interested. I mean, you do a number of translations where you explain the sort of word use, but it was interesting to see, for example, that the order of things, which was originally les mots et les choses, which would have been words and things, was changed because if I remember this correctly, there's already a book or a few books perhaps that use that title, and therefore they had to change it in English. And I was always curious as to why they did that. But it's interesting to think in that way, that the French and the English would have an effect on, of course, on the interpretation. Did you then read them as a comparison, which I guess would have been incredibly time consuming? Or did you read primarily in French and then maybe check the English, or vice versa? How did you work with both French and English text?
I worked in every way I could. So sometimes I would read them for instance, This Is Not a Pipe essay, which I first read in English. I then went back and read in French, and then I compared the two texts and the different versions of those two texts, because it's incredibly complicated in terms of a publication history. I had to do what I would say is a bit of philology and translation theory in my approach. That is buried underneath, let's say, the actual book project, but it haunts it. As you say, I try to gloss certain words in English and French and try to compare them. So I did actual reading through entire texts and comparing them in entirety, or sometimes passages that I found significant in English, I would go back and check in French. And sometimes when I was using an English version and I went back and read the French and saw how different it was, then I would read the entire French version and then rethink the entire English translation, having gone back to it. So I think I worked every way that I could think of with the English and the French. And one of the things is that versions of translations are really important as well. Who was doing the translation in English was important, where it was published. So as I say, it's kind of a philological haunting of my project. Philology is often disparaged in writing theory and about theory and philosophy. But for me, if you're going to do close readings of texts, it's a really important tool. And of course, it becomes more complicated when it's in two languages. But again, for me, that's a challenge that I quite relish as a interpreter.
Yeah, I mean, and it's really interesting, especially to see when you find certain words or phrases that are significantly different and you explain those differences to people who might not have been aware. It makes me think that, well, as you said, when you look at the interpretations of the works, you look at them at the time they were released, perhaps, then what they mean to different groups of people at different times in history. First of all, do you think that there is perhaps a French Foucault and an English Foucault that are different depending on whether you've read his work in English or French? Do you get the sense that that's a very different character?
I think it's a very different character. I think what the French tradition or academic and critical world has paid attention to in terms of Foucault is very different to what the English-speaking world has paid attention to. Now, there are some important exceptions to that in the current work of the translation of the seminars that hadn't been published in Foucault's lifetime and which are still being published and subsequently translated. Mm-hmm. because there's a team of people working on those who are French philosophers. Frédéric Gros is the most important of those, and American philosophers. Arnold Davidson at the University of Chicago is the most significant of those. So they work as a team together with some other people, and there's an interaction and an agreement, I think, that's reached in regards to the transcription of the seminars to start with from the manuscripts, and then also in regards to the translations that appear afterwards. So in regards to the earlier published work by Foucault, including all of his critical writings, which are short critical writings, which are massive in number, there you see less of a coordination, and there you see how very different he looks in French in terms of what's been published and where, and how he looks in the English-speaking world.
Is there anything that comes to mind when you think of that, when you think of potential differences between the French and English Foucaults?
Well, just in regards to my own field of art history and my project of Foucault in painting, the essay that he wrote on the painter Réberol was available for a very long time only in French, and then it was published in a very obscure place in English. So nobody really knew that he'd written anything about that artist and that it could be included in his thinking about painting. So that would be a good example, I think. Whereas in France, at the time of the exhibition that he wrote about Réberol's exhibition, it was published in Paris. It was well known to all the, let's say, cognoscenti of Paris, connoisseurs of Paris, or critics in art and art theory who were interested in contemporary art. That essay was known.
There's a lot of things that I'm sure we could talk about in different disciplines about Foucault. In terms of your reading of him, is there a difference in how he's interpreted or used perhaps today than he was during his lifetime in art history? Has that changed? Have you seen a change?
In art history?
Sure.
Specifically?
Sure. Or if you have examples outside of that, that would be fine too. I'm curious if, having read this and thought about him during the time in which he was writing, like you said, in one case, maybe a reading came out later in English and therefore he became more known for that later in his life or potentially posthumously. But yeah, when we think about it, I mean, Foucault was really writing up until the 80s. And then in 2019, many, many people are still reading him and using him to think through many subjects, including art history. I'm wondering if you've noticed a change in the way he's used or the importance of Foucault over time.
I do think in terms of art history that he hasn't been recognized in the last generation or two of students and scholars. As I said earlier, he was massively recognized starting around 1970 until about his death, let's say 1984, in art history. But I would say that in later generations, in later decades, he was less known and he hasn't been used a lot. So one of my contributions in this book is to put him on the table again, so to speak, for the discipline to say, wait, we better think about some of this. It's important. Mm-hmm. He's writing about really significant paintings. He's writing about the canonical history of art. And this is a major philosopher. We should pay attention to what he's thought about it. But the other thing that I wanted to say was I just chaired a session, organized a session, I should say, at the College Art Association of America, whose annual meetings were the middle of February. That session was called Foucault in Art History. And I made a call for the session so that I could ask the discipline as a whole, young people, older people, what is it that Foucault has done? How has he intervened in the discipline? What is he productive for thinking today or in the future? And the variety of responses I got was amazing. First of all, the number of responses was quite good, but also the variety of responses and all kinds of ways that people have started to think about what would Foucault do for art history today, or what could he do? And what resulted was a very interesting session where papers were really interrelated. And often in these kinds of scholarly meetings, our papers in sessions aren't always interrelated if there's an open call. But this was very good to think of the themes that emerged in each talk or across the four talks that were given. I did come out, though, after listening to those with the belief that we need to rethink Foucault now, and that he does have a lot to say to our discipline, but that people haven't really been thinking about it seriously. They've taken certain aspects of his writing in Discipline and Punish to talk about the ways that visual images mean in a surveillance society, for instance, which is very important to contemporary art history and to theories of photography and the digital image. But they haven't really approached his thinking about painting or his thinking about the philosophical project of art in a serious way in a number of years. And so this session might be called a beginning for that. I hope it goes further on the part of the scholars who spoke and also maybe in my own thinking. So my answer is a little bit long-winded here to say that I think we don't really have a good sense of where he figured in art history in the last 2 or 3 decades, because maybe he wasn't figuring large at all. Mm-hmm. But that people have been thinking about it, they just haven't been writing about it. And in some sense, people just absorb his thinking, for instance, in Discipline and Punish on Surveillance, or in the Order of Things chapter on the necessity of vision and visuality in terms of the gaze. But it hasn't been articulated in terms of the present, as I said, and I think that that's something that might change.
That's exciting, actually. It's great to know that there are so many people thinking about Foucault in so many different ways. And yeah, I think because he was such a prolific thinker and writer, I think a lot of people have taken him up in various different ways. I'm wondering if in your book, in approaching your book and thinking about Foucault and painting, how did you negotiate making sure that painting was an important element of his thinking and explaining that as as the purpose of your book, among other things, but also not saying what could be an easy trope to latch onto, which is that, the real secret to Michel Foucault is painting. You must understand painting in order to understand Michel Foucault, because I can see that kind of thing happening sometimes where, for example, if you don't understand Michel Foucault's sexuality, you'll never understand Foucault. So the secret to Foucault is sexuality, or the secret to Foucault is the discipline that he went through when he was younger and the schooling he went through, the magic bullet, so to speak. And of course, I don't think you do that in the book. I don't think you're claiming beyond what is actually there that, painting is the secret key to Foucault. But I think you could have. How did you negotiate making sure that it was an important element of his work, but not going overboard and sort of suggesting that this is the linchpin to everything he did?
I really like that question. I find it's too easy in contemporary scholarship, in any discipline in the arts and humanities and social sciences. It's too easy to make your argument the necessary argument for thinking about the whole topic or the whole field that you're encountering in your research, because it's a certain kind of a self-promotional issue of how to get noticed in an enormously complicated and fast-moving world if you're a scholar, to make your contribution so important to everything that it concerns. So it's an easy way out, and it's problematic for me. So I always resist that. And the other thing is I'm a historian, and I really want to situate my interpretation and my findings and research. And there's always a much broader field or context that every finding and all research falls into. It's never unto itself alone. And it's the context and situation that I find interesting. And that humbles one. That makes one humble, but it also makes one see how, for instance, in the case of a major philosopher like Foucault, he too was working in major fields and major areas. And you can't say that everything he said about painting was the be-all and end-all of thinking about painting, even though he himself was incredibly versed in the history of art and did a massive amount of research in that field to write his various essays on painting. But I just think that we can't say that was a final word in any of his topics. So I just think it's a question of a certain degree of humbleness in terms of the scholar themselves, and also a certain perspective on history and its situatedness on the part of the investigator and interpreter.
Mm-hmm. As you say, if you're trying to publish a book, if you're trying to be noticed, if you're trying to get your name out there so that if you're an early scholar, people will take notice of your work and who you are, what you're doing, it's very easy to exaggerate an argument or to maybe just fall into it and not realize that you have. Do you have any advice for people who might want to do a project like this where they're looking at something specific, like what you're doing is Foucault on painting, but perhaps what somebody else is doing is another major thinker's contribution to, or another discipline, or a slightly smaller or more obscure part of a bigger oeuvre. Do you have any suggestions for approaching that and keeping a sort of level head?
Always be aware of your limitations as a scholar and the fact that the limitations can be strengths. That's how I would put it. To speaking to a younger colleague, or the way I advise my students when they're writing their dissertations and master theses is, this is a contribution. It's an important one because I really don't think anyone should write a thesis or a dissertation that doesn't have some original significant importance for the discipline or the field of study they're working on. But it's also important to say that a strength of making arguments and maintaining positions in the course of writing and interpreting, one of the strengths is knowing your limitations and the boundaries that exist in your project. And for that, you can make your own argument much stronger, but it shouldn't overarch everything else in terms of the limitations and boundaries that are present. Now, this is something I think, and I say this to my students, that comes with experience. How can you know the boundaries? Often ambitious early scholarly projects aren't aware of boundaries and don't take them into account, and therefore become really, really audacious and interesting. There are projects like that, but you always have to be careful not to overreach, even if you have an ambitious project. So my advice is just be aware of limitations and think of them as strengths, not as deterrents, but as strengths. And if you can identify those limitations and where they are important to your own carving out of an argument or carving out of your own position, then it's just going to be a much better project that you're working on.
Yeah, I like that. I think that's really great and important advice. In your preface, you ask, would it be too far-fetched to say that painting became part of Foucault? And you don't think so. So I'm curious if Foucault now, his work and his thinking on painting has now become part of you and part of your approach. Have you taken away, or what have you taken away from doing this project, from thinking with and through Foucault, that you might continue to think about or use in any of your work to come?
I have to say that one of the things that's happened to me after working on Foucault for these number of years, and I think it's seriously working on him for at least 10 years, is that it's really hard to avoid him in anything I'm doing after that. I mean, this book was published at the end of 2017. Is that right? I can't remember now. I can never remember the date of the publications. Yeah, 2017. So It's been a couple of years now. And I'm really finding that when I teach something, other fields or other topics, when I think about how to approach certain subjects, Foucault is always emerging as significant for me. And I just think that is an aspect of the strength of his philosophical thought, to put it in kind of major terms. You said that he was one of the major philosophers of the 20th century. I totally agree. Well, if someone's a major philosopher of the 20th century and you worked on that person in an intensive manner, as I have, it's going to be a hard thing to shake or to move away from, even if you want to, because the significance of the thought is so important. And it continues to resonate with me. Just as I will say, the philosophers that influenced Foucault himself, for instance, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who was so important for his thinking, he resonates with me too, because I had to look into his philosophy to understand Foucault's ideas about painting. So it really is maybe something I can't get away from, and I have to be aware of that because there are other ways of looking at things. Other philosophers through whose lenses we might think about art and visual culture. So I'm trying to be really careful about that.
Yeah, I mean, and that's an excellent point about his influences as well. I remember this joke that was floating around online, I think, about how somebody was reading Derrida, but then another grad student or professor says, like, well, in order to read Derrida, you have to read all of Heidegger. And in order to read Heidegger, you really have to learn German. In order to learn German better, you really have to go to the older ancient German texts. And anyways, it seems like it can easily be a never-ending process of, if you want to understand Foucault, you have to understand Merleau-Ponty and all of the other influences of him. How far did you take that? Because of course there's limits to what we can do, but as you said, in order to really understand what he was doing in speaking about painting or writing about painting, it helps to think about who he was using to think through. And I do like how you mention a number of texts that he clearly had read or was relying upon, like I forget the author's name, but the one on photography and the history of photography that was clearly influential to Foucault. It was interesting to see what he was reading to help him think through it. But yeah, how far do you take it? Do you have any strategies to deal with that when you're thinking about the thought of one person that was clearly influenced by others?
Yeah, that's a method question again, which is so important. The photographer that he was so influenced by, historian of photography and a photographer, is Giselle Freund. She was also very important for Walter Benjamin's thinking about photography. I just want to say that for me, you can't put any stoppages on where to go, because the work and the thinking leads you in the directions you should go, and you shouldn't try to stop yourself. Of course, the reading is infinite. The field of philosophy is an incredibly large field and difficult field. And even if you just stick to who were Foucault's influences, you could never do enough reading and all of the reading. But you should do what you think is necessary to make your arguments if you're writing about him. For me, that's a lot. It's a lot. I mean, in art history, when I learned art history, we had to know 3 or 4 languages because we were expected to read the literature in all those fields having to do with whatever our research might be. I mean, I was trained as a Europeanist, and in one sense, you might say that was an easier thing to do than people now who are trained in contemporary art history, which is a truly global phenomenon. For me, there might not be an end, and that's one of the exciting parts of being a scholar, is that who else in our culture can go that deep for that long into any one particular subject?
Yeah.
This is what we can do that other people can't do. And it's less and less likely in this world that they can do that. One, because they don't know as many languages as scholars, because English dominates in the scholarly fields now. And if you're doing historical work, then you may not have the tools you need. The other thing is that things are just moving so fast in terms of what used to be called the information age, that there's just so much information. How could you possibly go so deep when you have to stay on the surface to get across it all?
Yeah.
I'm just wanting to say that the sign of a scholar is that you can go deep.
Yeah, definitely.
I hope that is attractive to a lot of people. It's certainly attractive to me and has been.
Yeah, I think definitely in an age of, what Nicholas Carr calls the shallows, when we're dealing with a lot of sort of superficial information online, social media and such, it is really refreshing to see something like the work that you're doing and like the work that a lot of scholars are doing in terms of the depth. But at the same time, arguably we're in a very precarious, depending on people's positions, but a precarious situation for academia in general. Publish or perish. Do you have strategies, I guess, to think with that in mind? Like, for example, you might want to read everything Foucault has ever done and everything that he's ever read, if possible. But you also want to maybe be working towards tenure if that's the case for you, or to complete a graduate thesis or dissertation. Do you have any advice for continuing that almost infinite process, but also producing enough that you're satisfying certain requirements? Yeah,
that's important. And also to be able to be, let's say, realistic in the world today. What is required to have a life in scholarship or a life of teaching in the university, or even what is required to have the life of an intellectual today. You have to be real about it, because as you say, there are requirements. And if you aren't real about it, you're not going to get there, and you're not going to be able to participate, to use a Foucauldian term, participate in the discourse. Mm-hmm. I think it's really important to define your topic of research, to make sure, as I say, you know the limits and the limitations and see them as strengths, but also to define it carefully so that you can achieve it. And it isn't possible, if you want to get tenure and you have to write a book to do it in the arts and humanities, this is what has to be done, then you need to make sure that you have a topic that can be accomplished and that won't require 15 more years of research, because you have to move on and be promoted, et cetera. Mm-hmm. In the academy, if you're there, or if you want to be a more public intellectual, you have to be able to publish essays and articles on a lot of things, and perhaps be in the media field and deal with that. So I just think it's important to know how to define a topic and to know once I've defined it, that's what I'm going to do. And that's as far as I can go. And the next project might take me further in the same direction that I couldn't achieve in a realistic manner in time to write a book, but that I will now follow again or further. So I think the defining of a topic of research is really important. And so many proposals for fellowships and book proposals that I do read and that I do adjudicate are way too general and way too unspecific. And that is not how to define a topic.
Mm-hmm. As you move forward with your work, do you think that you may have, while retaining a lot of what Foucault has written and thought through, that you may want to or need to move on to something outside of Foucault, or do you think you'll continue working on subjects that are, if not about him, then at least, sort of related to his trajectory as well? Have you had enough Foucault?
No, I haven't had enough. I mean, I really haven't, which I might say is rather unusual in my scholarly life, because in terms of many of my other projects, I've had enough by the time I finish the book. Mm-hmm. But in this case, I haven't had enough. And in fact, I'm working on a couple other pieces of Foucault that for future articles and essays that I think are important that I couldn't, write about in this book because I had to find my topic as painting. I guess, no, I haven't had enough. And I'm even thinking that maybe I need to do something on Foucault and art history explicitly, which is not what this book is about. This book is about Foucault and painting. So that's one thing I might be working on having to do with Foucault. Mm-hmm. But I am also going on to talk about, I'm working on a large project on embodiment and performance. And it's I don't want to say too much about it because it's in progress and I'm still not quite clear about exactly what direction it's going, but my interest is in how does the body work in art and why and when. So that's my next project. There is, of course, some Foucauldian aspects to that project, I guess, if you think about his work on sexuality, mm-hmm. but it's mainly concerned with theories of embodiment in different disciplines and what that means.
And I don't want to put you on the spot or anything, but I'm curious if you could answer in your mind, whatever comes to mind, why do people keep coming back to Foucault? Like, what is it that attracts us? And maybe that's individual, maybe that's unique to a lot of different scholars, but in your mind, why is he such an attractive scholar to think with and through? And what keeps people continuing to come back to him year after year?
That's a really good question. Again, I think it's in part a sign of a major philosopher, a major thinker, that people do keep going back years, decades later. People still go back to Hegel and Heidegger. Mm-hmm. Foucault is such a person, such a thinker, I should say. Well, one thing, though, that attracts people in the post-1980s era about Foucault is that he wrote about so many different things. He has something to say to almost every field in the arts, humanities, and social sciences. He really does. He's thought, not just say to those fields, but he's thought through topics and aspects that are significant in those fields in a significant, let's say, deep way. He's thought about those things. He's written about them. And so all kinds of different people are attracted to different parts of his thinking and writing. And the other thing is that he did write so much, not only that he wrote about so many things, but he wrote so much of which was not published in his lifetime. That is, in terms of his seminars that were written and researched and delivered as lectures at the Collège de France, those are still coming out, and that's really a long time after his death in 1984.
Wow. Yeah. So
he's still offering things to us that we didn't even know about, let's say 10 years ago.
Yeah, there's so much to say, as you mentioned, about Foucault and his work. And I really enjoyed seeing your interpretation of his work on painting because, as I said, you highlight a lot of the ways, not just that he spoke about painting, which is interesting in and of itself, but the ways in which it influenced or helped him think through a number of other issues about subjectivity, representation, and the sort of contemporary world. As you move forward, is there anything that you think people still haven't quite gotten to in terms of Foucault's work, and maybe that means in your discipline specifically, but are there avenues that you hope people will further explore that maybe haven't been so much?
I think so. I think that one of the things for people interested in historical material, especially, is that there hasn't been enough serious attention paid to his theory of the archive and his theory of statements. Let's call that not a theory of enunciations, as earlier linguists might have spoken about, but as a theory of statements and what they mean for thinking about history. I think that Deleuze, a friend of Foucault's and a contemporary philosopher in the French milieu, said some really significant things about Foucault and his assessment of his colleagues' work that have not been explored in depth and seriously. And I think they would lead us to understand a lot more about why Foucault is so important for thinking about history and its importance for the present. So that's one direction I think people could go.
I think it's exciting to know or to hear you and see your work and think about all of the future potential, if not even just reading all of the work that's already been out there and the ways in which that can help us think through so many different subjects. Yeah, Catherine, I want to thank you so much for speaking to me today about your book, Foucault on Painting. It was really great and interesting work.
Well, thank you so much for such a great conversation. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
As always, thank you very much for listening. We're coming down to the wire. We have 2 more podcasts that I'm really looking forward to sharing with you, the audience. In 2 weeks, I have Jeff Farrell talking about his book, Drift. Jeff is one of the coolest sociologists, criminologists I've ever met. And then the week after that, or 2 weeks after that, I should say, I have Heather Ann Thompson, Pulitzer Prize winner, Blood in the Water, about the Attica prison uprisings. I'm really excited to share both of those interviews, which I've already completed, to wrap up season 2 of This Is Not a Pipe podcast. Again, make sure you check us out on all your favorite social media, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube. Always appreciate a positive review, and I really do appreciate the people who have done that already. Until next time, I'm Chris Richardson. Cheers.